Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this session, The Equity Imperative. My name is Eddy Voltaire. I am your moderator. I am with DCS. I am a sustainable building consultant.
Hello, my name is Derrick Tillman. I'm president and CEO of a company called Bridging the Gap Development. We're a mission-driven for-profit real estate development firm based out of Pittsburgh. Our mission is to bridge gaps of opportunity, and also bridge gaps in development. We do that through various kinds of development projects, including affordable housing, market rate, mixed income, commercial, retail, office, mixed use, as well as community and cultural space.
Hello, I am Witham. I am the Director of Sustainability at the University of Southern Maine. My day-to-day job is trying to lessen the environmental footprint of the university, but I always try to step outside my job description and do as much social sustainability stuff as I can, like equity work and decolonization and things like that.
Hi, Alexis Washburn. I am the Northeast Regional Director at Emerald Cities Collaborative. We are a national nonprofit based in DC, but we have regional offices in Boston, Southern California, Northern California, and Seattle. Much of our work in Boston is focused on entrepreneurship and development for women and minority-owned contracting businesses.
Hi, my name is Yuan Tan. I am with RMI on the Carbon Free Buildings team, and a lot of my work is focused on efforts that advance holistic building decarbonization as an intersectional solution for climate, health, and equity.
Thank you. All right, equity. Equity is a worthy goal in and of itself because of its moral implications. It's linked to social and spatial justice, community development, down to the basic human rights to exist. I think to start this conversation around equity, you have to address positionality, right? Knowing where do you stand in what is your biases, right? I think that it's an important aspect to build equity. So the first question would be, what is your definition of equity and how is it applied through your work?
Equity, in my mind, is really about complete, inclusiveness. Really ensuring that you have folks involved from every aspect, from the opportunity side, of course, being in the room, but that's really just the bare minimum. Being fully engaged, fully involved, actually having a voice, in the results that are delivered for, whether that's a project or a policy, et cetera. And then also engage and involved on the back end so that they benefit from, what is being, developed, discussed, advanced, et cetera. When I think about diversity, I heard it said this time, something like this, diversity is being invited to the party. Equity is being asked to dance. And if you've ever been to a party and you're just on a wall, you don't really enjoy that party. Versus, really being asked to dance, you really feel like you're a part of, of it. You're having fun. It's a totally different experience. So, as we think about this, we need to make sure we're asking people to dance. And, I think even in this room, if you're seeing some new faces for the first time, introduce yourself to them, ask them to dance, essentially. Introduce yourself so that they don't feel like that person on the wall that's not really engaged and having fun at the party. But I think not just in this room, as we go back home to our own networks, to our own spaces and places, carrying that forward. But then thinking about how can I support these individuals that I met and also find ways to work with them. So I think that's a high-level perspective of equity.
That's so great. I don't know how to follow that. The metaphor that I like to think about is, it's not just leveling the playing field. It's helping people who are not on the playing field get on the playing field to start with. Like, what equipment do they need? What skills do they need? That sort of thing. And then it's not just about the players. It's about the spectators, too. What do the spectators need? in order to watch the game. You know, what are the sort of aids that they need to be able to participate in that process? So it's as much about who isn't in the room and who isn't at the table as it is who is at the table. And that's all I'll say.
I think I'm going to adopt some of these analogies into my own ever evolving definition of equity. But rather than touching on the definition, I think just touching on how we might think about equity and understanding that it's always evolving. We don't necessarily reach this point of equity or at one, I mean, that's the goal, I think, at the end of the day is to get there. But understanding sort of what progress looks over time and understanding we might have made certain changes to our process or our policies or whatever it is, but recognizing that that's not the last step that we need to take, that there are additional steps after that point in time to, again, push forward to even more equity.
That was very deep. I think I don't need to add to the definition of equity, and I think I'd like to talk about kind of like the foundations of some of that work. And I think this is a great venue to talk about that because we are thinking about buildings, and I think buildings are a perfect manifestation of, you know, the human lived experience, right? I can look around and go outside and I can see a physical manifestation of, you know, both capitalism, but also, you know, decades of discriminatory practices. And I think that that is a great reminder that there is work to be done, but it's also a great, I think, message that buildings are a great venue for us to advance climate, health, and justice work, and that we should continue being open to that and to fold that into our work, that recognition, to allow us to really holistically move forward with our work instead of, you know, building silos, you know, building like echo chambers, so then we can like fully move forward together, which I think is something that equity is really all about, is that it touches everybody's lives and we can't be like moving forward in isolation. And I think reckoning buildings as a venue for that is like really important.
I agree. Buildings are extremely important, right? But the in framing equity, it's a conversation that's difficult to have without speaking on race and issues surrounding class and power. Through your work, what do you see as the major obstacle to facilitating equity?
You're asking the deep questions.
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges that I've experienced in my current work and as well as in past organizations and positions is that a lot of people aren't equipped with the right language necessarily to discuss some of these issues because of their, you know, upbringing, their socialization. They don't really understand how to say certain things or feel comfortable saying certain things, understanding that saying, you know, that I'm a Black person, like that's not a curse word, like that's who I am, that's how I identify. And so I think that's one of the first sort of barriers, impediments to having a lot of these conversations is that people don't even know where to start. But I think something that I've been learning, especially over the last 2 years, and I think a lot of my colleagues as well, is that you have to start somewhere. And so creating a safe environment to have these conversations. So rather than just thinking we're architects or we're engineers or we're policymakers and we design, build, et cetera, you know, these things, but we're doing that for people and people are impacted by the decisions that we make. And so we can't sort of gloss over or not necessarily talk about the hard conversations because it's important and it's relevant to what we're doing.
I think I'd like to add to that. I think one of the biggest challenges that I have observed is that equity has become, or has traditionally been, something that was negotiable. That was like, oh, you know, we don't really need to think about this. And I think the hurdle here now is how can we fold in this notion of equity into something that is non-negotiable and something that is, you know, automatically considered and automatically thought about, because our communities can't wait anymore. We shouldn't be sacrificing these things for other priorities. I think for me, the challenge is, how can we ensure that, equity measures are as important as, energy savings? How can we bring that into the common lexicon, that it's not something that is separately considered, but it's something that is part of everybody's understanding and everybody's approach?
I like to piggyback on that. I think so race, class, power. I mean, it impacts everything, and it has for generations. And I think it's been treated like an ad alternate, you know. So almost like granite countertops. It's nice to have it, if we can afford it. But if we can't, then we won't include it. And now granite's out, and now it's quartz. So it's like we've kind of transitioned, and I think equity or even certain discussions about race or class has been kind of treated that same way. And because it's not been prioritized, it's easy to kind of be, VE'd out in a sense. I think we got to be honest, and I also want to talk about history. When we're having this conversation, history is key. We really have to look back and understand our history so that we're not doomed to repeat it. And really understanding how our history has led to some of the conditions that we are in today. Without taking an honest assessment of that perspective, of that lens, of that truth, we really can't make the proper decisions going forward. So I think being able to understand that, and now the decisions we make today, use it as an opportunity to right historical wrongs. Also use it as an opportunity to guide future decisions. Whether we like it or not, race is connected to everything. It always has been. And I think the sooner we get honest about that, the sooner we can actually do something about it. But we ultimately want the same thing. So as opposed to it has to be this or that, quartz countertops or granite. It's like, no, we all want a nice home with nice amenities. We all want, to have opportunity. We all want to be able to pass on generational blessings and leave a legacy and things of that nature, and just have a good quality of life. And how does that play out? How does that impact, environmental justice decisions? How does that impact things like incorporating passive house and living in a thermally comfortable environment? How does that impact ensuring that opportunities are created, for all races on this development project? These things are interconnected. But I think we have to have an honest perspective about where we've been, so that we don't continue it, because race will continue to be a factor. Power, as far as policies and policy makers, kind of the same perspective, just ultimately a different lens, a different starting point. But at the end of the day, still having damaging effects unless we're honest and we use that as a guide to making for a better future.
With that being said, right, I think you touched on an important aspect of history. America's first wrong is what? Land acquisition, the taking of land from indigenous tribes. Aaron, you have a unique perspective of working with indigenous people. I think is appropriate for this conversation.
Yeah, so what we did in Portland, Maine, when we embarked on building several buildings, and one of them is the Passive House building, which is why I'm here today. Passive House Residence Hall, 580 beds, right in pretty much the heart of Portland, just off the peninsula. The way we started that conversation about, righting the past wrongs and recognizing the past truths is by recognizing, like, whose land is that? it's obviously not the colonizer's land. I mean, we act like it is now, right? But it's actually indigenous land, and whose land in particular. So recognizing that that land is Abenaki land, first of all, and that there are 4 sovereign tribes in Maine today, sovereign nations of people, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Maliseet, and Mi'kmaq, who are members of our community. They're faculty, staff, they're students, they are general community members in that area. We wanted to recognize that land as being theirs. And the recognition is just like the first baby step, right? People could do land acknowledgements at big events, and they can put plaques on the wall and say that this is native land and all that stuff. And that's great as a mini baby step. But what's really needed is a much larger conversation about how can we repair some of the harm that's been done, the cultural and physical genocide of hundreds of years. So to do that, the way we approached it is we paid a land recognition committee of Native-only people to sit on a committee and to try to accomplish 2 goals. One, how do the current Native people of the land we now call Maine, Wabanaki territory, how do they want to be recognized? How do they want that land recognized? And number 2, what do they need for resources? As members of this community, they get tuition waiver in Maine, but they don't get a room and board waiver, so that's one thing. They've been wanting a Native student coordinator position for years, so that's another thing. And there's a whole list of needs that they have that we could find out about by having this paid committee. It's important to pay committees like this because too often the folks who had the harm done against them have to offer their services free of charge to repair the very harm that was done to them. So it's really important to pay people for their time. So we had a committee with those 2 goals, and it has started so many amazing conversations at the university. There's been a lot of growing pains with this. It has not been an easy road. There have been all kinds of challenges building those relationships between the 4 nations and the folks at the university now, but it has absolutely been worth it, and there's a lot of work being done now around this. So yeah, that's one example of how you can work on that.
Community engagement is key, right? And thinking about it, it makes me think of New York City, right? New York City is how it's built and overbuilt. It's a cannibalistic city in nature, right? You have to destroy to rebuild. So the question around equity also includes creating equity as well as preserving equity, right? So how can we have new developments in communities and not discard the existing programs that have organically created the existing community? How do you build new without destroying what's there?
I'll start. So I think that is a really challenging question, and I don't know if anyone has figured it out. If you have, please raise your hand. Love to talk to you. Yeah, go ahead.
You ask the people who live there what they want to say.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Getting the perspective of the people who already live there. But I think another thing to also consider is maybe some of the unintended impacts of a certain project. And so it might be great to have a redevelopment project because it's increasing the usability of a certain building or property or something like that. But sort of understanding how that's going to impact the people that already live there, I think is a really big question. And particularly when we're promoting passive house or energy efficiency or any of these other really great programs that improve the quality of life, improve people's health, and also save energy. I think another thing that we're really concerned about is green gentrification, basically. And so understanding, if you have these new buildings that are supposed to be for everybody, but they're increasing costs so that the people who live in those neighborhoods can no longer afford to live there, then that's a really big issue.
I think to the point that was mentioned, definitely engaging with the local residents, the people who have been there for that time is key. and really engaging in a robust, meaningful way is really key. But I think even before that, before you get to engaging about a project, building relationships with those individuals and with that community, even before you're actually in the implementation phase, I think that's really important. It really makes it meaningful, genuine, and you establish that relationship as also you establish a grounds of trust as you're moving forward. I think you have to be intentional about your decisions. So being intentional to not erase culture, but to preserve culture. And it's easy, when you're thinking about development, we're just going to come in and do all this new stuff. But really being intentional to preserve the existing culture as well as the people. So thinking about anti-displacement strategies, anti-gentrification strategies, thinking about the preservation of affordable housing. And I know depending on where you work in this space, you may not have as much influence about everything that's done, but you're in the room. You're a part of the project. So really just bringing your voice to the conversation is important. But for us as a company, and our name, Bridging the Gap Development, it has true meaning. It's not just a catchy name. We really are focused on bridging gaps. So what that really means is that we begin with equity. We begin with social equity as opposed to that at the end where it can easily be kind of knocked off. And what that does is it establishes that groundwork that everything else that we're doing, even things like energy efficiency, passive house, etc. Social equities first, then all the other added benefits that we can continue to drive. And it's not necessarily one or the other. We see them as interconnected. But we begin with social equity because that's the most important. So that impacts opportunity, that for residents, that impacts opportunities for MWBEs, that impacts preservation of history, of culture, and it also helps guide decisions. So you're thinking about things like it was mentioned, I think, in the last panel about things like environmental justice. In predominantly African American communities, this has been an issue that's plagued. Well, we understand how passive house can be a part of that solution to not only not continue those kinds of policies and decisions, but really set a new standard, a new bar. But again, when we start here, and we make this decision to do passive house, it has different kinds of meaning. It definitely has the meaning as it relates to driving down costs and reducing energy load and electrification and reducing the carbon footprint. But we go before that. We think about the social equity impacts and how pervasive policies like environmental justice have devastated these communities, and see passive house as a solution in it, and to that, but then also all these other added benefits. So I think that's what guides our decisions and is kind of the framework that we work from.
Speaking of passive house, let's look at the benefits beyond cost. Right? Passive house has a lot of benefits that's not quantifiable monetarily, right? It's a known fact that 90% of people spend their time, 90% of the time people spend is indoor spaces. And it's known that indoor spaces are not exactly the healthiest, right? You're better off outside than you actually are inside of the built environment. And passive house provides a solution for that. And I wanted to ask you, what are the non-monetary equitable outcomes delivered by passive house that makes it your tool of choice?
So in my work of promoting, holistic building decarbonization, we are not about promoting, the application of disparate building interventions on a very diverse building stock. And I think that we're finding, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room are familiar with, Passive House very succinctly and effectively captures this complex relationship between building systems, housing quality, as well as the very real lived experience of its residents. Um, and in thinking through that, and to your question about, how do we capture these intangible benefits, I think it's thinking about actually they are pretty tangible. Like, I'm living this. This is felt. This is experienced. And one of the things that I've been very head down on is really the health benefits of, an improvement to our living space. And I think something that I would like everybody to think about is how can we really account for like the true cost of business as usual, the true cost of these old systems in our buildings. I think one of the recent things that I read that really resonated with me is, how do we casually just accept the asthma burden that comes with the use of our gas stoves? Like, how are we just accepting the outdoor air pollution impacts of combustion in our homes? And what I would love to see, and if anybody here is involved with that, would be more monitoring, a pre and post of, understanding what is this true cost of the reality that we have right now, and, post intervention, post upgrade to, Passive House standard, what is that improvement? And if we're talking about health, I think that that is a great step towards quantifying these so-called intangible benefits that I actually believe are very tangible. And we can begin, thinking about how we can incorporate that into, like the life cycle assessments, financing cycles. I think like very often we think about simple payback. I don't think that that's serving us very well anymore. And I think that we can be expanding our definition of how we look at the true cost of stuff to really fold in a larger amount of things and help us also in thinking about opportunities. How can we access more resources, whether it's healthcare funding, thinking about lives saved. I think that there are many ways of, putting a dollar amount to that if that's what resonates with people, and getting that, formalized into the way that we think about our buildings.
I don't want to feel like I'm dominating the time, but the
Take it away, Derrick.
developer, it's hard not to say something because these questions impact our work, directly every day. But I'll answer it kind of both tangible and intangible. So you kind of heard a lot about how we think about and approach our work. I think from a social equity perspective, that's the kind of doing good. But we're a for-profit company, so these decisions still have to make sense from an economic perspective. So on the tangible side, it's this is going to reduce our costs, our operating costs as a developer. It's also going to reduce the operating costs or our expenses, I should say, for our residents. So that's a win-win. That's something that I can sell to investors. That's also something that I can sell to future residents. If it's a home ownership project, it's something I can sell and market, to home buyers. In addition to things like thermal comfort, in addition to energy efficiency, in addition to advancing equitable, advancing decarbonization. I think the intangibles. The intangibles, like basically reducing tenants' utility bills, and that affects everyone, whether it's a market rate home or affordable housing. But I want to talk about affordable housing specifically. It's a big deal when you create more disposable income for a lower income resident. I think higher income folks, they have disposable income anyway. But it's a big deal because what does that mean? That means that there's more nights out with the family, whereas you couldn't go out for pizza because that meant that decision or paying the gas bill. It's literally that big of a deal. Or being able to have new school clothes for uniforms or something for beginning of the school year. It means maybe being able to go on vacation that year. when you really aggregate it. What does that impact? That impacts quality of life. That impacts, your mood. That impacts your mental health, you know. And a lot of folks may spend more time indoors because they don't have money to go out and do some things outdoors. So it also may increase physical activity, increase, getting more vitamin D. So it has so many other things that we don't really think about. But this decision does make sense, on the economic side for the developer, for the resident. But then it's all these other intangibles that I think are a big deal. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
I think one thing that I'd like to add is that we've identified a lot of the tangibles and intangibles, both for the consumer and for the project developers. But there's also the people who are in the middle, who are the implementers, the tradespeople who are actually constructing these buildings. And so I think one of the reasons why our organization that's working primarily with entrepreneurs, so women and people of color who have their own contracting firms, one of the reasons why we like to promote Passive House is because it is a significant opportunity and allows those businesses to differentiate themselves from their competition who might just be using traditional building methods and materials and equipment. And so I think one of the other key reasons why we like to promote Passive House too is, especially in Massachusetts and I'm sure in other states as well, is that there's been significant investment from the public sector as well as from the private sector. So thinking about utilities to promote Passive House construction. And so if women and people of color who are in the contracting trades, don't know about these opportunities or are not learning about these new opportunities, that's missed economic opportunity for them. And so making sure that they're aware of sort of, what's new and what's upcoming and what, frankly, I think a lot of Passive House is stuff that a lot of people have already known for a long time, but it's just increasing in popularity more and more as we go. So we don't want there to be huge project developments and, communities of color and women are unable to take advantage of those because they don't have the right training or resources.
I think that speaks volumes to the next question about strategizing and moving forward. Right, where do we go from here? Moving Passive House forward, seeking equity.
I think that we need to be bringing up the baseline. I think that we should be demanding a most basic level of living quality and housing quality, and that I think there are many ways of doing that. I think off the top of my head, I'm thinking, zero emissions appliance standards, building codes, like any way that we can make our ecosystem make the natural choice that, Passive House standards are the only thing that makes sense. I think that requires creating this ecosystem, so these baselines that make it basically impossible to do anything else than, ensuring that housing quality is there, I think would be really important in terms of like broad strategy. It has to all come together.
I think with Passive House and other sustainable building and development techniques is that we don't do enough to share our own success stories. And so there are lots of myths and rumors floating out there that it's hugely more expensive, it's not affordable, it's not accessible to everyone, and all of these other things. So I think as there are more Passive House projects that are permitted and completed, and people are starting to live in them, sharing those success stories, not only maybe from the project developer side, but from the people who are constructing those buildings, as well as the future occupants, hearing what they have to say about living in those buildings. I think, for me at least, one of the key things is for a lot of different sustainable building practices, when you get to experience it, you realize this is pretty awesome and I want to live here, I want to work here. And so creating those opportunities for people to tour those buildings, I think, is also hugely impactful.
I think it would be great too if we could incentivize or require some research into like what impact is the building going to have like in the neighborhood and in the city it's in, and who benefits, who's going to be negatively impacted, that sort of thing. to get at a lot of the intangibles that, Derrick always talks about, like beyond the walls of the building, like what's this building and who's going to live in it? What's going to be their impact from having lived in a building, having had, more affordable rates of housing because it financially makes sense in the long run to build a passive house and being able to keep rates low. But what else can you do in the building that would help out the community and things like that? So I like to think not just how do we make passive house the minimum baseline, but what else can we do to kind of poke and prod people to do a more mindful development when they are doing development? Like, how can we make them do the research? And also, how can we make them build in the time that it takes to do that kind of effort? Because so many of these projects are just always on a fast track, right? There's always like, oh my God, we got to get this building done by May of 2024, and we don't have time for any of this other stuff. We don't have time for equity or anything else. And everybody's just in this horse race. And then they pressure, the city councils or the planning board, whoever they're getting approval from, that we don't have time for any extra work. We just got to get it done. Our financiers are waiting on that return on investment, and we just have to get it done. But sometimes you just need to slow it down and actually put in the time to do things right.
So where do we go from here? That's a loaded question. And I really don't think
All of
there's
these questions are loaded.
facts. I don't think there's really any one specific answer. I think we all have to do our part. Collectively, we win. The Chinese proverb what was mentioned earlier, and that's really it. But we have to collectively be resolute in leading in each of our capacities as well as collectively. We're only going to get to where we want to be by going together and collectively staying resolute in that, because we already know that there's many that don't believe in what we believe in, but we have to be resolute in what it is that we're doing. Also, I think about this question in the terms of carrots and sticks. I like to focus on the carrots. Developers don't like sticks, by the way. I understand these new building challenges and things.
That's an inside joke.
And those are good things, but just me personally, I think I like to focus on the carrots. So more subsidies, to incentivize the passive house projects, to more soft sources, to fill gaps, to make affordable housing projects work, as well as the missing middle income housing for home ownership and things of that nature. So I think we need more subsidies. We need more leadership from a policy perspective. Yes, to bring some policies forward, but also resources on a federal, state, and local levels. Is another thing. And then we need training. I heard it mentioned earlier, but I'll reiterate it. We need more training programs to prepare the workforce for these kinds of opportunities, whether we're talking about, in a clean energy jobs space, installing things like solar panels, renewables, working directly, on building passive house buildings, electrification, whether that be, on the building side or even electric vehicles. These things are interconnected, and we're both kind of moving in the same direction, but ultimately that's also a lot of opportunity. So we need to prepare the workforce for where we're going. So those are just some of things, but again, we all kind of have to be resolute in leading and work together.
That's a real active approach, right, to engaging with passive house, where neutrality doesn't exist, right? You have to take a position. You're either on one side of the fence or you're on the opposite side. If you say nothing, do nothing, then you're agreeing with the status quo, right? Then there is no moving forward. This brings me to my, well, let me paint a picture and kind of step back a little bit, right? And bring it back to like an individual basis in an organizational level. Play a little bit of devil's advocate. Thinking about our organization, Passive House Network, the Passive House Institute, this incredible amount of resources at the institutional and technical level, right? That allows just about anybody to gain a solid to a basic understanding of what it takes to work through and deliver a passive house. Literally a step-by-step playbook with the technical savvy to address anything in between, right? Any issue that might come across, we have the organization to address that problem. This speaks of the energy to me that Passive House puts forward. If this energy was incorporated in the same manner towards equity, what can we accomplish, right? I think about the steps that Passive House Network has taken underneath Ken's leadership in introducing a fellowship to bring in more diverse ethnic groups into Passive House Network and evidently into Passive House, right? Just by a show of hands, how many people in the audience know of the fellowship that's been set forth by Passive House Network? Okay, not too many. How many people now know about the fellowship that's been put? I want to see everybody's hands go up, maybe two of them. So now I want to task everybody in this audience to use that same energy that it takes to produce Passive House to engage equity and pull in more people, right? So we could build this community and keep the conversation going, right? Let's do more because we can do more, right? At some point you have to ask yourself, is this enough? What should or can we do? What should be done?
No, it's not enough. Sorry. I know everyone out there is working hard, and I commend everyone's efforts, but it's not enough. You know, and we can do so much more. I think within our own, work, but also with bringing more folks into the fold to multiply our efforts. I think about, I think Boston came up and told about they started with one house and now it's, I think 20,000. There's our example, and that's one of many. So, really starting with small efforts can bring forth major monumental change. So I think that's really what we can do, and then assessing ourselves. I think we know when we can do more as it relates to this equity conversation. Am I could I be mentoring a young person to maybe I don't have the decision making power to decide if we do this kind of passive house project or not, or the level of MWB participation. So one is to ensure that that's a part of the conversation. But beyond that, it's like, could you be mentoring someone in your realm? Bringing up another young person, exposing them to this industry. Being bold enough in the room early on to say, well, how does equity play into these decisions in this project? How are we making sure opportunities are going to be advanced for minority contractors or subcontractors? Are there any minority? Are there any African American architects working on this project? Within our firm, can we identify someone to work on this project, or give them more of a leadership role in an existing project? So I think there's multiple ways that we can do more in our own spaces and places, but it does require leadership. It requires boldness, and it requires a willingness to accept that challenge, to say, am I doing enough? Could I be doing more? Because I think the reality is this: if we don't say nothing, we're furthering the status quo, and really, in that case, we're part of the problem. So, and I know this room is the room full of innovators, disruptors. This is a disruptive, conversation. What we're talking about is disruptive. We got to bring that same, mindset, that same energy to the equitable and equity space, and we can do it. We're already those leaders. It's just carrying that forward, carrying that ball forward. A few more yards.
Just going off from what he said, if you're in the room and you don't know how to start approaching this, just start asking questions. Just say, like, who's not here that should be? Who's being impacted by this? Whose land is this? What communities are here? What are they doing? What are those communities doing actively right now? Like, what are their needs, wants? What do they use this space for, this area? Just start asking questions. Questions are easy to formulate. They're a sentence long. Anybody can say them. They're super easy. But like Derrick said, if you're not asking those questions and no one else is, then you're part of the problem. And that's unfortunately the way it is. You can't be on the fence with this. You're either, helping it, or you're silent, which is, as they both said, furthering the status quo. So my advice would be just start asking questions. And it's easy to do.
I think you both have made really great points about asking questions and asking who's not in the room. I think it's a big issue when you don't take time to recognize who isn't here and who isn't present and who isn't given an opportunity to participate meaningfully. And the Passive House, as a concept and organizations and this work, you guys are a niche group, you're a small group. And so I think it's really easy to get really comfortable at conferences like these and say, like, I'm seeing everyone that I know, who's not here. And I think, Derrick, you made a really great point about bringing people up, so looking for opportunities to mentor younger people, but also thinking even before that point comes. I know it's really great to have the new fellowship and that it's focused on architects and engineers, but thinking, who's outside of those professional careers that could benefit from learning and being involved in Passive House. And I would say even, starting earlier than, someone who has already graduated from college, but thinking about people who are in middle school and high school and teaching them about building science and these different practices, because like Yuan has said, everyone experiences building. So, these topics are complex, but they know what it's like to experience a building. And so highlighting that this is a career opportunity for them can be extremely pivotal, because I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of people out there in young adults' lives that are saying, you can't do this. And they need someone who's there to say, no, you can do it. I'm going to help you. I'm going to show you. And I think that's a role that everyone in this room can play.
Everyone. I think that's the key word. Thank you so much, Passive House Network, for this fellowship. And I know that, there are many other efforts to bring in more diversity and have a more inclusive practice. But I think, let's remember that this is everybody's problem. And if we take a look around the room today, I would say that the majority of the room don't look like most of our panel right now, right? And I think in acknowledging that and not being uncomfortable with it, but just accepting that reality that this is everybody's problem, but this could also be everybody's opportunity, we can become comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations, like Aaron had said, asking the questions, figuring out what can be done. And I think when we are all comfortable with approaching equity, I think that that's when we can see some real movement towards a better world.
One last thing, I'll be remiss if I didn't mention this, and you just helped me remember listening. You know, bring forth our questioning and things of that nature, solutions we have, but also listening to minorities and others that don't typically have a voice, listening to those community members that don't typically have a voice, to be a part of bringing forth the solutions. it's frustrating to me, as a developer when I see, new, uh, financing solutions being brought forth, which are good in from the place it came. It was like, okay, I'm trying to bring this forward, but then as a practitioner, I look at the metrics of it. I'm like, this won't actually help me, because it's missing the mark on so many things that we need specifically. Whereas if we were a part of creating that, we could have made sure that it incorporated those components that really help us move forward, and that so ultimately that it was structured right. And I think similarly, being able to listen to make sure that even the solutions were being brought forth are also structured right.
So we have 5 minutes left, and I promised I wasn't going to do this to you guys, but I can't help myself. Um, if you could describe Passive House in one word, what would that word be and why?
What are words? Ideal.
Are you going to say why?
Eddie didn't ask why, right? You just said describe. So.
Absolutely, ask why.
Well, Chris, I think, Passive House represents a very good quality of life, right? And I want to see that become, the standard, like the ideal of what everybody should be able to experience. And so that's my word.
I would say holistic, because Passive House is looking at how different building systems interact, how users of that building interacts with the building. And I think with this conference and the discussions that we've been having today, I think it could be holistic even from the sense of equity. So it's not just saying these are our building systems, but also looking at the social aspects of that building and saying, okay, these are the people who are interacting with it. This is, whose land it is. This is the historical impacts of whatever happened in this place or within this culture or society. And so I think because of that systems thinking and that perspective that Passive House brings to a project, I think it allows you to incorporate other things that are just as equally important.
I guess I would say baseline, just because I think it should be the baseline for everyone, because everyone deserves that quality of space to live in or to work in.
I had like 5 words in my mind. I'm gonna go with the first one, equalizer. And I say that because it really has the potential to equalize and level set so many different facets. Um, you know, and then we talked about it throughout this talk, but I think I will go with equalizer, because it really can, really reset, a lot of different components as it relates to how the built environment impacts all of our everyday lives and our lived experience. So equalizer.
I would have to say revolutionary. And my reason behind that is that Passive House goes against the entire industry as we know it, right? It doesn't conform, right? It sticks to what it knows. It produces sustainable buildings. So, with that being said, that's pretty much our time. Um, I would like to close by saying this that this is the first ever that we've had these conversations at the conference. And it's a real step forward in the right direction towards achieving equity and really thinking about your own positionalities and what does equity means to you and how do you bring it to the forefront of the conversation while you're engaging communities and moving Passive House forward, right? We're heavily embedded into building science, but there's also a social aspect of Passive House that we also have to keep in mind and push forward universally. Thank you.